Hello, my name is Sam Asher. I'm Executive Director of the Virginia Holocaust Museum. At the museum, we look to safeguard the stories of victims of genocide and educate our visitors about the dangers of hatred unchecked. The members of the board and staff do not take this responsibility lightly. And for myself, the history of the Holocaust is personal. My family came from Płonsk, Poland. I had a large extended family that lived in Płonsk for many generations. That all changed on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. Because my family was Jewish, they were subjected to discrimination and violence. Many died in concentration camps. My father, Cantor Arthur Asher, an American Jew studying in Europe, met the family in 1937. He kept a journal with all of their names and relationships. And by the end of the Holocaust, 73 members of my family had been murdered by the Nazis. Those that did manage to escape rebuilt their lives in Australia and Israel. The main entrance of this museum has great significance to me. It is here that you will see an exhibit about Poland, the Warsaw Ghetto, and train tracks used for deportation to Treblinka, a Nazi killing center. It is on tracks like these that my family was sent to their deaths. Learning about the Holocaust is difficult. It is a dark history that spotlights the worst of humanity. Nonetheless, it is an important history and one that needs to be confronted. It is through an examination of the Holocaust and hearing the stories of survivors that we're able to see the slow and systematic way in which people were labeled other, dehumanized, and then marked for murder. The Holocaust would not have been possible with just Hitler and the Nazis. The success of the final solution required collaborators and bystanders, people who participated in Nazi atrocities and those who remained indifferent to the Nazi crimes. We often get asked, how does the Holocaust happen? Why didn't more people speak up? To help you answer those questions, I ask that while you're taking the tour of the museum, you not only listen to the history, but reflect. Reflect on the responsibility of those that were not in Nazi uniforms. Ordinary German citizens like teachers, religious leaders, scientists, doctors, friends and neighbors, who over a period of 12 years were witnesses to Nazi atrocities and remained silent. Unfortunately, injustice, anti-Semitism, and racism did not end in 1945 with the Holocaust. So I ask that you reflect during this tour, and I also issue a challenge. Now that you know about the history, what are you going to do the next time you witness an injustice? I invite you to begin your tour of the Virginia Holocaust Museum. The museum's Director of Guest Services, Matt Simpson, will be your guide.
Hi, I'm Matt. Please join me as we begin our tour at the museum boxcar. Here is a German boxcar, which was obtained in 2003 from Haltern am See, Germany, through the efforts of Holocaust survivors J. Ipson and Alexander Lebenstein. It is the largest artifact in the museum's collection. This boxcar was built in 1928 and was used on the German railways during World War II. While there is no evidence that this train car carried human cargo, it is identical to one type of freight car the Nazis most frequently used to transport Jews across Europe to the killing centers. The SS crammed 80 to 100 people inside these boxcars. Men, women, and children suffered in horrible conditions. There was no food, water, or even a place to sit down. These train rides could last for days.
What was the transport like going from the ghetto to the camp?
It was a car, red, not green like the one outside.
A railroad car?
A railroad car. It was pretty frightening. We knew where we were going. We spent 2 nights and beat it a day and a half. That summer was very, very hot. Some people were dead on arrival in Auschwitz. If there was a frightening moment in my life, that was probably it. But at the same time, there was a sense of resignation. If they kill me, they kill me. There's really nothing we can do about it.
And there was a train.
Yeah, when we walked on the train, you know, it wasn't train like transport people. This train was like to transport packages or whatever you do, you know.
Mm-hmm.
There was no
freight.
There was no seat on it, nothing, you know.
Mm-hmm. Was
nothing.
a freight.
A train, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they have those little windows, you know, and they was closed up with barbed wire, you know, these little windows, not like, and there was no seats in it. Mm-hmm. We have to stand up all the time, you know.
Mm-hmm.
No toilet. They have some dish there, you know. The German standing by, because the German was on the train too.
For eliminating something.
So you have to go to the bathroom. People see you when you go to the a dish, you know, something. And we couldn't sit down. It's like a herring. We was packed like that, you know. They put in so many people, you know, to the train, you know. We were standing up, laying on each other.
Were you with your family? You all together.
Right. I don't know how we survived even the trip, you know. And that lasted, had lasted about 2 or 3 days, I don't remember exactly. Seems to me lasted at least for a week, you know, because it was, when you're standing up, you know, and you don't sleep, nothing, you know, and practically you don't eat hardly anything, you know. So it seems longer.
Between the museum entrance and the front door are authentic cobblestones from the main streets in the Warsaw Ghetto. Stones like these are visible in the street scene photo on the right, taken in the Warsaw Ghetto in the winter of 1940. Lining the cobblestones are rails from the tracks that led directly into the Treblinka killing center in Poland. Many of the 350,000 Jews deported from Warsaw were sent to Treblinka to be murdered.
Like I said, we live very close to the Warsaw Ghetto, which is, if I looked out the window here, not even a whole block, like a half a block, less than that, was the Warsaw Ghetto. And I would walk every day and I would see the ghetto, which was a very big brick wall. They were all closed up and Germans were all around. And they would be on the second floor, above the brick wall, and everybody look at people walking, that we were so lucky we were free. One day I noticed that they made a hole in the brick wall and snuck the baby there. But every day I was walking, I saw the poor Jews dying there from hunger. I couldn't do anything. I keep on going.
Inside the museum, right outside the entrance to the permanent exhibit, you will notice the names of Holocaust survivors that have passed away. These were men and women who came to Richmond after 1945 and helped to build our community as they rebuilt their lives. Their legacy lives on with their memories in this museum. Also outside of the core exhibit entrance is a bench with a sign reading "For Juden verboten," German for "Forbidden for Jews." This sign is intended to remind visitors of the fundamental ways in which Jews were systematically and legally removed from society. This is how the Holocaust began. Jews were forbidden to walk on sidewalks, to practice white-collar professions, to marry non-Jews, or even to sit on benches like this one. The sign similarly reminds the visitor that this sort of injustice is not unique to Germany of the 1930s and 40s. These benches come from the former Broad Street train station, now the Science Museum of Virginia, here in Richmond. Signs declaring whites only or no coloreds were posted on these benches. As one goes through the museum, it is vitally important to remember that the Holocaust, while unique in many ways, is at its core another example of the dangers of hate and intolerance. At the conclusion of World War I, Europe lay in total disorder. Its economies in shambles, its populations decimated, and its cities destroyed. In subsequent years, Germany fell into one of the worst depressions in modern history. The War Guilt Clause of the Treaty of Versailles named Germany as the sole guilty party for all losses caused by the war. In the post-war period, the Weimar Republic, Germany's first attempt at a democracy, was installed. Germans distrusted Weimar from the onset, and the failure of the Weimar Republic to pull Germany out of its depression provided an entrance for the Nazis into German politics. Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, otherwise known as Nazis, filled the political vacuum of late Weimar politics. Hitler appeared publicly as a passionate, charismatic speaker, promising to solve Germany's problems. Although Hitler's own anti-Semitic beliefs were well known and documented in his memoir, Mein Kampf, his party did not come to power on an anti-Jewish platform. What made the Nazis appealing to Germans was the change they offered. Hitler pledged to create jobs and a vibrant new economy that would make Germany the envy of Europe, and promised to return German territory that had been taken away after the First World War. The Nazi rise to power was rapid. In the 1932 elections, the Nazis won 37% of the seats in the Reichstag, or German parliament. And though Hitler was not an elected official, he was appointed chancellor. After the death of German President Paul von Hindenburg, Hitler took total control of the government, assuming the position of Führer, or absolute leader. Infused with racial principles, the Nazis viewed the German people as the only pure race, sometimes called Aryans, while other races were labeled undesirable. Although Judaism is a religion, under the Nazi racial ideology, it was categorized as a race. In an early step to consolidate power, Hitler created new facilities called concentration camps, where his political enemies were imprisoned and mistreated without legal recourse. The first of these permanent camps was Dachau. The Dachau concentration camp was first used following the mass arrests ordered by Hitler in early March of 1933. Nazi SS and police rounded up political opponents, communists, socialists, liberals, conservatives, and members of religious parties affiliated with the Catholic and Protestant churches. From 1934, this process expanded continuously to include Jews, Sinti and Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and Protestant and Catholic clergy who opposed the Nazis. In 1937, the Gestapo, Nazi police, created an all-purpose term, enemies, and began arresting and confining those considered asocial. This was anyone who was deemed a real or potential risk to the country or an enemy of the German people. Asocials included alcoholics, drug addicts, beggars, homeless, the unemployed, and repeat offenders with petty criminal records. People that were physically and mentally disabled were also considered burdensome liabilities upon the state and targeted for elimination. In the Dachau exhibit, you see a replica of a prisoner barracks. In the same room, the visitor finds part of a concentration camp prisoner uniform, believed to be from the Sachsenhausen camp. It is authentic and was worn by multiple Nazi victims. When inmates were killed by SS guards or died from disease, starvation, or exhaustion, prisoner uniforms were cleaned and reissued. Note the colored patches worn to identify the categories of inmates. These uniforms and ID badges are an example of the dehumanization of undesirables that characterized the Holocaust. In concentration camps, triangle patches on uniforms functioned as a classification system. Green inverted triangles represented criminals. Red represented political opponents. Black for those labeled asocials. Homosexual men were given pink triangles, and Jehovah's Witnesses were identified with purple. On the wall, opposite the barracks, is a list of the meager rations fed to prisoners, much of which was barely edible. Prisoners were purposefully underfed so that those who were too weak to work would die quickly. Inmate life expectancy in the camps was short. The enlarged wall photo of SS clerks at typewriters was taken at Buchenwald in 1937 during the national asocial action undertaken by the Gestapo. The men standing and those sitting behind them on the ground had been arrested in a national roundup the night before and are being registered as new inmates. Note with the photo the SS typewriter on the desk. Machinery like this was essential for the Nazis in industrializing the efforts of targeted harassment and ultimately mass murder. In the 1920s and 1930s, America did not allow for mass immigration. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1924 was openly racist in restricting the entry of refugees and was crafted specifically to keep out Italians and Eastern European Jews. Among the exceptions were landowners and farmers, and others with skills in engineering and the sciences, who on occasion were issued visas and allowed into the country. In 1936, Dr. Kurt Bondy, a German Jewish social psychologist, founded an agricultural training school in Grossbriesen, Germany, to teach young German Jews farming skills to improve their prospects for immigrating. In 1938, Bondy made contact with two wealthy Virginians, prominent philanthropists William Thalheimer Sr. and his cousin Morton Thalheimer Sr. To enable Bondy's Jewish students to immigrate, the Thalheimers purchased Hyde Farmland near Burkeville, Virginia, and established it as an agricultural education institute. With determined persistence, they overcame the objections raised by the U.S. State Department and beginning in 1939 started the process of bringing students from Grossbriesen to the farm in Virginia. Of the 200 students, Dr. Bondy managed to get 150 out of Germany. The remaining 50 perished during the Holocaust. In 1941, with the U.S. entry into the war against Germany, the Thalheimers sold Hyde Farmland, and many of the young Jews there joined the United States Army. In fact, one, Ernst Kramer, a former prisoner at Buchenwald, became part of the liberating forces at that same camp in April of 1945.
And we planted some crops that were unusual for the area, like berries and grapes and fruit trees, to develop an alternative to tobacco farming. And we also built 10 chicken houses that we cut the logs ourselves, and we built brooder houses that we built the blocks, made the blocks ourselves to raise baby chicks in. And we sold the eggs from those 10 chicken houses to a farm hatchery, not for eating eggs, but by selling them to a hatchery, you got a better price for that farm. So each of those houses held 250 chickens, and that was 2,500. We built 10 houses. That was, for that time, fairly large operation already.
Over a 36-hour period between November 9th and 10th, 1938, the Nazi Party and its SA and SS units went on a rampage against German Jews, destroying Jewish homes, synagogues, and businesses throughout Germany. The pretext for these attacks was the November 7th assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by Herschel Greenspan, a Jewish teenager whose parents, along with thousands of other Polish-born Jews, had been expelled from Germany. Presented to the world by Nazi propaganda as a spontaneous explosion of German nationalism and outrage, this national pogrom consisted of calculated acts of violence. During this nationwide attack, called Kristallnacht, more than 10,000 Jewish homes and businesses were looted and destroyed. Approximately 30,000 German Jews were arrested and imprisoned, and an estimated 1,574 synagogues were destroyed. The SS reported that 96 Jews were murdered during the violence. In the aftermath, the Nazi government fined the German Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmark, roughly $450 million in 2021, to pay for repairs and cleanup in cities damaged by the attacks. Hitler also ordered the confiscation of all insurance payments to Jews, so the victims of the violence had to pay twice. Beginning in 1941, all German Jews over the age of 6 had to wear the yellow Star of David on the front and back of their clothing. Similar measures had been or would be introduced across almost all Nazi-occupied territory. Marking with the yellow star, coupled with the reliance on Nazi racial pseudoscience, was the final measure required to make possible identification, arrest, deportation, and extermination.
Then we were told that the synagogue was being broken up and damaged very, very severely. But again, my father's friends came and said, Nathan, don't worry, they're not going to come here. They know that you are a true German and you fought in the war, in the First World War, side by side with us. They're not going to touch you. They're not going to do anything to you. You've never done anything wrong. And they're just not going to bother you. My father, even at that particular time, still wanted to believe, but I saw him also getting very anxious. And we heard that another Jewish home was being plundered, and it was suggested by my father's friends that he should go and put his medals on his chest that he earned during the First World War to show that he is a veteran and that he has a right, like anybody else, to live there, which he did. He put on his medals and with some friends stood in front of our home. I was standing right beside him, and here these hordes of people suddenly came around the corner screaming anti-Semitic slogans, some of them carrying an axe or sticks, and they did not even bother to wait to come close to the house. And I heard the window shatter, my father screaming out to these guys, "You cannot do this to me. How dare you? I'm German," and all this.
Did he know any of them? Were these people he knew?
There were some, I knew a couple of the children that were dressed in Nazi uniforms that a couple of years prior went to school with. Mm-hmm. The parents already, converted them to the Hitlerjugend. I'm sure that my father also recognized some, but a lot of these SS uniform people came from out of town. The leading people, I believe, came from out of town. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be able to verify if my father knew exactly who was who. Mm-hmm. And here they were breaking the windows, and before you know, people started to run into the house, and some of them went upstairs, and before you knew it, my parents' bedroom furniture were flying through the window from upstairs into the street. And I heard my mother scream inside, "Let's get out of here. They are killing us. They're killing us." By the way, this is recorded in the archives in Halton, so I just want to mention it so it could be verified that these were my mother's words.
They documented this themselves
Yes.
in Halton.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And here I'm staying with my father at all simultaneously. This all happened quite fast. And here this big SS guy approaches him, comes straight to him, and my father holds out his arms to say, "Stop, you cannot go into my house. How dare you? Get these guys out of here." And this SS guy said, "What do you have there?" He says, "I'm a German soldier. I'm a decorated soldier. I fought for this country, and I have a right to be here." This SS guy looked at him, and he tore the medals off his chest, stamped down on these medals and broke them in the street, and then spat in his face, started to beat down on him. And here I'm holding on to my father. It's the first time that I saw my parents being beaten and chased. And it became obviously probably the most hurtful time in my life, more painful perhaps than the physical pain I endured later on. It left an everlasting damage to me. I recall this moment very clearly.
In early 1939, the Nazi government allowed 937 German Jews to purchase tickets on the MS St. Louis, a German-American luxury liner based in Hamburg. With their tickets for a one-way transatlantic crossing, many passengers had also secured landing permits for Cuba. The St. Louis, an 8-deck liner with room for about 1,000 passengers, was one of the last ships to leave Germany before World War II began. Several days after sailing, Captain Gustav Schroeder received word that the passengers' Cuban entry permits had been canceled and were useless. When the St. Louis arrived in Havana, nearly all passengers were denied entry and forbidden to leave the ship. Cuba's director of immigration had sold the refugees landing permits, which resembled visas, but which would only allow them to enter Cuba temporarily as tourists, not as resident refugees. The Cuban president refused to honor these documents. Ultimately, only 28 passengers with family ties to Cuba were allowed to disembark. Appeals were made to President Roosevelt and the US government for assistance, but these were ignored. Captain Schroeder and his passengers had no choice but to return to Europe. On June 6, 1939, after lengthy negotiations by the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, Belgium agreed to take 214 passengers, Great Britain 228, France 224, and the Netherlands 181. Ultimately, most of these people were swept up in the Nazi invasion, captured, and murdered at Auschwitz. With the Nazi invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, violence against Jews swept across Eastern Europe. In addition to military violence and anti-Jewish legal action, civilian attacks against Jewish neighbors became commonplace. Jewish homes, shops, and synagogues were ransacked and destroyed throughout the East. Thousands of Jews were murdered. Under the guise of creating a peace between Jews and non-Jews, the Nazis created a system of ghettos, areas where Jews could be centralized and contained separate from non-Jewish civilians. Museum founder and Holocaust survivor Jay Ipson and his parents were imprisoned in the Kovno ghetto in Lithuania in August of 1941. Jay's mother, Eta Bochumovitz, was born in Lithuania in 1911. In 1933, Eta married Israel Ip. Their son, Jay, then Jakob, was born on June 5, 1935. Jay's father, Israel, attended law school, but Lithuanian restrictions on Jews prohibited him from practicing. To support his family, he obtained a job with the Belgian motorcycle company Fabriek Nationale. In August of 1941, the Ips were forced to relocate to the Kovno ghetto, a quarantined suburb of Kovno called Slobodka. The family lived with Eta's immediate family, sharing a small dwelling. In October of 1943, Eta's family was deported. First to Estonia, and eventually to Riga, Latvia, where they were executed.
And there was the Gestapo people, and they've been asking questions. And everybody used to answer, ask the name and the occupation and all that, and then one they say go to the right, and some of them they say go to the left. Groups, when they say talk to the first one and tell them, I say go to the right, the whole group goes to the right. To the right was back to the ghetto, and to the left was to the small ghetto. It was an opening to the small ghetto that we didn't disappear, that didn't run. Now, my term is coming, and the man was Roca. Roca was the head from the Gestapo. I got, they called him 2 years ago in Toronto, in Canada. I got his picture in my place. He was with carrying on with his little stick. And I coming up and he asked me my occupation. And my mind works a mile a minute. What should I say? Should I say I'm a lawyer? Or should I say I'm an automobile mechanic? Big choice. Right there in a second, I got to decide one way or the other. And a power in me tells me, do not say you're a lawyer, say you're an automobile mechanic. And what I got the knowledge about a mechanic, about the motorcycle what I've been pedaling around. That's all I knew was a mechanic. I knew a wrench from a 5/8 to a 3/4. But it's maybe I know. That's all I knew. The rest I didn't know nothing. And I didn't answer him so fast. He started screaming, beruf, and angry. And I told him, automobile mechanic. And he tells me, rechts. He made with his stick, rechts. It means the whole group. Everybody goes to the right. And there I already find another, more Jews in the corner, but they on the way to the ghetto back from where we came, back home. And then in front of me, a man say he's a teacher. And they're also a large group. Tell him to the left. And to the left, I seen us going, there was the way where they were staying, the Gestapo waiting to come in the small ghetto, back what they destroyed like a week ago. And here I see a lot of friends. I seen that my principal from school. I seen the president from Temple going away, and he stays in front of my eyes. The president from Temple was a tall Jew. He was 6'4", tall, slender, nice-looking man. And he was going with a black coat, with his black hat, going in the front, and they turned around. They looked backwards at us, and then disappeared. And they took everyone in that night. It was that day, not that night. 11,500 Jews, and killed them. All, every one of them was killed.
Okay.
After this deportation, Eta and Israel became determined to flee Kovno. In the fall of 1943, the couple made arrangements through Eta's uncle to escape the ghetto. The Ip family were taken in by a Catholic farming couple, Vaclavas and Ona Paskauskas. The Ips were hidden by the Paskauskas family, first in a barn on the property, and then later in an underground bunker dug by Israel, where they remained until liberation in July of 1944.
And the dog, when he used to bark, we used to know that people are there. And when we could go out, it is at night, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the morning, to catch your breath a little bit and then back again. Honey, what kind of life was it that was impossible? Impossible. People wouldn't believe it, that dead people were alive. It's like a grave. Exactly like a grave. That you couldn't stand up. Only was like for children. How we used to go in, we used to slide in the way I told you, on your stomach.
And when you were inside, could you see light?
No, nothing. I told you that we couldn't, it was so thick the air that we couldn't light up a match. A match couldn't be lighted up. He made a tiny little chimney, like probably like that was, that nobody could see. That's all, but it used to come in. Sometimes I think myself, how in the world did I went through? From where did I get the power? Is it power to life or power because maybe for my son? Because my son was my eye in my ear, and both of us.
After the war, the Ips were held in a German displaced persons camp before coming to the United States in 1946, where their family name was Americanized as Ipson. Like the Paskauskas family who hid the Ipsons, thousands of people risked their lives to save Jews. Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial and Archive in Jerusalem, has recognized these individuals as righteous among the nations. Diplomats like Raoul Wallenberg and Shune Sugihara secured exit visas, while industrialists like Oskar Schindler bribed and manipulated the Nazi slave labor system in order to keep workers alive. The vast majority of those who are deemed righteous among nations were ordinary civilians who hid or provided aid to Jews. In the case of children, who were often hidden in plain sight, families would frequently pay non-Jews to take in their young ones. In other instances, Jews were given false papers and assumed a non-Jewish identity.
So, but among all the people that came, the farmers, there was one very lovely woman coming and befriend us, our family. She was very, very lovely. She always would come by herself. And she says, my father spoke to her, confined her, how worried he is about us. Is there anything she can do? He says, you know, I have 2 daughters. I'll try to do something. I'm not sure, but I'm going to go to my priest. And maybe I'll be able to obtain papers, birth certificate for my own daughters. So like a week later, she came and says, you know, my father's name was Drexler. That was my maiden name. His Sir Drexler, I think I have some papers. I went to my priest, and I didn't tell him anything why, but I asked him, can you give me birth certificate for my own daughters? One is a year older, and one is younger. Anyway, she came in and gave us the papers. My father was so grateful. She's the one what you call really, truly a righteous Gentile. At that time, he had no money to give it to her anymore. And she did it without that money. She says, I'll come for the girls in about 2 weeks. And sure enough, she did exactly what she said.
As war broke out and the Nazis began to round up various enemy groups, thousands of average citizens took up arms in defense of their countries. Whether as part of organized movements, such as the French Resistance, or small militia units hiding in the dense forests throughout Eastern Europe, these groups played a pivotal role in demoralizing German soldiers and in rescuing Jews. Outside the Kovno ghetto, where the Ipson family was held captive, groups of Jews and communists banded together into partisan units that harassed and attacked the occupying German forces, carrying out sneak attacks in the middle of the night or blowing up train lines so supplies could not reach soldiers fighting at the front. Among these groups were the Bielski brothers family group and the Vilna Partisans.
So I went to the outhouse outside, and I saw a mass of people. It was from the small ghetto, but you have not seen the small ghetto. But I saw a mass of people, dark, a mass of dark, because it was early, 7 o'clock, it was October, 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, and the 9th fort is going up, hill up, and you could not see not the beginning and not the end of the mass, led by Lithuanian police and dogs, and moving. And this day, 9,200 Kaunas Jews were killed, shot by the Lithuanian police on the 9th fort, among them 4,000 children. And when I saw it, I decided, no, I will take the fate in my own hand. I was young, but it was not romantic and it was not idea. It was a real decision that I have to resist, that I have to find and be accepted in any underground organization. Doesn't matter which one, any underground organization. And I started to look at the possibilities, and really in a short time, 3-4 months, I was accepted to the anti-fascist fighting organization that was led by a young Jewish writer, Chaim Yelin. His picture is here also shown.
Children were not exempt from the policies of the Nazi regime. When the Germans invaded Poland and began establishing ghettos, entire families were forced to live in overcrowded conditions where disease and starvation took their toll. Because of their size, it was not uncommon for children to sneak in and out of the ghettos, stealing food to help support their families. If caught, they were often shot. The Nazis deported massive numbers of Jews, Roma, and Sinti to concentration camps, including children who held little value as slave laborers. Arriving at a killing center, children were typically separated from their parents and taken directly to gas chambers. Children often lied about their age in order to avoid the initial selection. By the end of the Holocaust, 1.5 million Jewish children had been murdered. By 1942, the Nazis moved away from open-air killings and towards industrialized mass murder. To carry out the final solution, camps were designed for the sole purpose of mass murder. The Nazis forced victims into overcrowded boxcars where they endured hours or even days of travel without food, water, or toilet facilities. Upon arrival at their destination, people were taken off trains and put through a selection process, after which most were herded towards the gas chambers. The Nazis tried to keep the final solution a secret, attempting to hide the true purpose of these camps from the surrounding communities and incoming prisoners. Secrecy kept victims relatively calm even while the process was carried out. For example, in the undressing rooms, Jews were ordered to tie together their shoes and remember the number where they had hung their clothing, giving the impression they would shower and return to collect their belongings.
You want me to talk about the car?
If you would.
So I'm 16 years old. I'm standing between my father and my mother. And we soon realized that we're going to Auschwitz. We knew what Auschwitz was. Maybe we didn't know about the gas chambers, but that people didn't return from Auschwitz, we knew. And probably the most traumatic moment in my life was when I told my mother, you gotta forget about me. You have to save yourself. Why? Because I was an only child, and she lived for no other reason but to see me survive. My father, by then, was very disgusted with life and probably did not want to survive. There were people who just gave up. If they didn't give up in the car, maybe they gave up when they realized that their wives were dead, their children were dead. And they became what we used to call Musulmane. You could see it.
Disaster. This was 8 o'clock in the morning. So we come over there, and I stayed with my family, and I had a friend of mine. I used to go to school with him, and he stuck with me, and I stick with him as friends, you know. And all of a sudden, the Gestapo come to me and pushed me in the train, me and him, and I left my family behind. I couldn't go back. First thing, to be honest with you, I think I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to know what's going to happen to them because I don't know. Just somebody told me, just push me in the thing. But I really didn't want to go see what's going to happen to my mother and father and my sisters. Really, I was so close. You know, I really didn't want to know what's going to happen to them. I see nothing good can happen, but bad. I said I really don't want to do that. And they pushed us in the train. We come into Birkenau, to Auschwitz. We come into Auschwitz. They said, you know, left, right, you know. So.
Let me back you up here. You've traveled, and I want to ask you a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
You were separated from your family then?
Right.
Did you ever see them again?
No.
That was the last time you saw them?
That's the last time I saw him. Okay, I tell you about it, what's happened, because they never saw him again. You can ask me what I tell you, but I got some, what's happened, I have relatives. They went with the second train. They survived. So I'm going to tell you what's happened. That took me into Birkenau, and so, what's his name, was over the Eichmann, and the rest Gestapo, and said left, right. So he come to me, he said, how old I am? I told him I'm 18 years old, I was 14, and my friend asked, he said, at 14, I see they send him to the children. I pulled him, come with me. So I see the Gestapo tried to look at me too. I took and I wear a long overcoat. I should look older, you know, and I was little anyway. And I went with the people, with the younger people. And they took him right to the gas chamber with the kids. And I went with the other side to work. I come into Birkenau. This is Auschwitz and Birkenau was one camp, you know, it's a different barracks, you know. I come over there, I said, well, I'm not going to survive in here. I said, definitely not. But I stayed over there. Next day, they sent my cousins. I met my cousins. And they said they took my father and mother, and just my father and my mother, to the gas chamber. And I did, you know, it was very tough. And he said, my sisters, they took in the barracks. And I found out later they took the whole barrack and burned them alive. Put a fire and they burned the whole barrack alive, and I had 4 sisters over there. And I had 5, but one of them, you know, the young one died in home. I mean, they killed her in home. I had 5 more sisters, and they burned them alive.
In the summer of 1941, the Nazis enacted the final solution. Initially, these murders were carried out by bullet in open-air killings. Ultimately, however, the Nazis chose gassing as the preferred method of industrialized killing, or killing run like a business. In 1939 and 1940, as part of the T4 program, the Nazis gassed approximately 70,000 physically and mentally handicapped civilians, so the Nazis had seen the effectiveness of gassing for extermination. As part of this process, they designated 6 killing centers in Poland where victims could be executed en masse. In some camps, like Treblinka and Chełmno, carbon monoxide was used. In others, like Auschwitz, Zyklon B, a cyanide-based insecticide, was used. The deceptive tactics used in the undressing rooms carried over to the gas chambers. Doors were often marked as bathhouses, and fake shower heads were affixed to the ceilings. Sonderkommando, healthier, stronger Jewish prisoners selected by the Nazis to work in the gas chamber crematoria complexes, guided the victims into the chambers in order to keep the crowds from panicking. With the gas chambers in place, the Nazis effectively industrialized the work of mass murder, but were left with the question of how to dispose of the bodies. In the early part of Nazi mass killing, those who died were simply burned or buried in large pits. But as the final solution took shape, the Nazis needed a more efficient method of disposing of bodies. To that end, contracts were signed with a number of companies, most infamously Topfensonne, to construct large industrial ovens for the killing centers. Sonderkommando were tasked with clearing bodies out of the gas chambers and destroying them in giant ovens. Before they were burned, bodies were searched for valuables, and teeth with gold or silver fillings were pulled. Eyeglasses, shoes, prayer shawls, anything the Nazis felt was of value or could be reused was taken. As Allied forces advanced, forcing a Nazi retreat, prisoners were moved back towards Berlin in an effort to conceal Nazi crimes and to preserve a labor force in the hopes of reigniting the war effort. These are known as death marches, movements that could last for days in brutal conditions. Anyone too sick or too weak to continue, or those who attempted to escape, were shot.
At one point, you had an encounter with people on a death march. Let's talk about that.
Things were getting kind of rough for the Germans, and so they moved us out. We marched out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we encountered the other prisoners. They forced us off the road, on the opposite side of the road.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it was at least a mile and a half of prisoners that you could see that had been in a prison camp for some length of time. Small children, older people, they could barely walk.
Small
Some
children.
of them were on blankets being dragged. Pitiful. They brought tears to your eyes to see it. You really didn't want to look at it. It was one of the worst sights I've ever seen in my life.
By early 1945, the Soviet Army had liberated the concentration camp system in the East, and by spring, American, British, and Canadian forces were liberating the camps in the West. These soldiers were the first witnesses to the full scope of Nazi atrocities. By May, the Nazis had been forced to retreat to Berlin, where they officially surrendered on May 8, 1945.
The prisoners, actually, the minute the gate was actually entered, they began to grab clubs or anything they could find, and they clubbed to death a lot of the farmer German soldiers there.
I believe I read they also clubbed the dogs.
Could have been, yeah.
The
unfortunately, there was electric wires around the camp, and some of the prisoners were so eager to get to the Americans that they ran into the wires, and there were several electrocuted. Another thing that happened was the American soldiers, not thinking or not knowing, started passing out food in great quantities, and they started gulping the food down, and on empty stomachs, a lot of them died because of that. We soon learned to, or the people learned to feed them very slowly and far apart.
Carefully.
Another thing, of course, the prisoners wanted to get out and head for wherever, and the American troops couldn't allow that because they were suffering every disease almost known to mankind, and so we had to keep them in.
After liberation, most Jewish survivors had no place to go. Those who tried to return to their pre-war homes were met with resistance and sometimes violence. Over 1,100 Jews were killed in Poland after liberation. Pogroms in Poland continued until at least July of 1946. Simply put, anti-Semitism in Europe did not disappear with the defeat of the Nazis. Survivors continued to be confined in displaced persons camps, otherwise known as DP camps. Allied forces struggled to bring Jewish refugees basic services, food, water, and medicine, while keeping them interned to prevent outbreaks of violence and undue stress on local populations. These camps were administered by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, otherwise known as the UNRRA. As conditions improved, the UNRRA brought in groups who instituted training programs, and they established the Central Tracing Bureau to help survivors find lost relatives. It was in DP camps that survivors began to return to former traditions. Schools were established, religious holidays were celebrated, and musical and theater troupes were formed. While life slowly improved for Jews over time, the thriving Jewish culture of pre-war Europe never recovered. Before the Nazi period, there were approximately 11 million Jews in Europe. Today, there are only about 1 million. This is a legacy of the Holocaust. As World War II came to a close, the Allies faced the complicated question of how to hold the Nazis and their collaborators accountable for their crimes. Initially, there was support for summary execution. The United States held the position that a trial or series of trials must be held in order for justice to be carried out properly. After intense negotiations, the Allies drafted a document known as the London Charter. This agreement amongst the Allies became the blueprint for the International Military Tribunal that began on November 20th, 1945 in Nuremberg, Germany. The indictment at Nuremberg listed 24 people, including Hermann Göring, President of the Reichstag and Hitler's second-in-command, Hans Frank, governor of Nazi-occupied Poland, where 6 million of the 12 million were murdered during the genocide, and Julius Streicher, editor of the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer. The United States held 12 additional trials in Nuremberg. These trials saw the indictment of 185 defendants. 12 of these received death penalties, 8 life sentences, and 77 received some duration of imprisonment. Beyond Nuremberg, the Allied countries were each involved in trials of the so-called minor perpetrators, which took place in almost every part of occupied Germany. Ultimately, the IMT would be seen as the beginnings of international law and directly influence the creation of the International Court of Justice. Trials of Nazis have continued since the Holocaust, with some having taken place as recently as 2020. Dedicated in 1871, the Chore Shul of Kovno, Lithuania, is considered one of the most beautiful synagogues in the world. Museum co-founder, Holocaust survivor, and Kovno native J. Ipson replicated this architectural treasure to offer visitors a glimpse of the rich Jewish cultural life in Europe before the Holocaust. On display in the synagogue is a Holocaust surviving Torah scroll from the former Czechoslovakia. This scroll was taken to London, England for conservation before ultimately being donated to the Virginia Holocaust Museum. Though local survivors re-established their lives, they always bore the burden of immense loss. Designed by sculptor Al Rosenbaum, the Tower of Remembrance honors Virginia survivors' relatives who perished in the Holocaust. The hexagonal structure of barbed wire frames a yellow Star of David. In this space are photographs of Nazi victims who have no grave. On the wall hangs a painting by Ephraim Rubinstein that depicts Emek Shalom Cemetery, Richmond's Holocaust memorial. Hovering above the tower is a stained glass window. The window depicts the flames of the Holocaust lapping around Mount Sinai, while black letters spell out the Hebrew word Zachor, or remember. As you conclude your tour today, we urge you to consider not only the history of the Holocaust, but the lessons of the period. What can be done to counter intolerance and combat hatred? What do we do when we witness bigotry? What can happen when prejudice and injustice go unchecked? The museum exists to prompt and to answer these questions. Thank you for joining us on our virtual tour. When it is safe to do so, we hope that you will visit us in person. Museum hours and opportunities to contribute to our mission can be found on our website. Contributions to the museum and appointments in our Carol Weinstein Research Library can also be made by phone.